Right. Thank you, everyone, for having me here this morning. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank John and Janine for once again inviting me up here to join you. I was here last year, so I'm sure I met some of you then, and for those of you I didn't meet, it's nice to see you. So on behalf of the Office of the Information Commissioner, I'd just like to thank you for hosting this event. I think it's really important for you guys to be able to come together and talk about the issues that are common to you. As Janine mentioned, at the Office of the Information Commissioner, I do a lot of the engagement and training work, particularly rural and regional councils. So in that environment, it's very similar. We really encourage people to try and get together as much as they can, just to learn from each other and set up communities of practice. So, you know, what you guys are doing here is really worthwhile, and again, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be part of it. So while 2019 marks the 10-year anniversary of right to information and information privacy in Queensland, where's the time gone? The community's right to access government information is actually hundreds of years old. So in order to understand where we are now in Queensland with our legislation, I thought I'd start by taking you on a bit of a journey through history to highlight some of the key milestones that led to the creation of our information access and privacy legislation. On the 2nd of December 1766, Sweden became the first country in the world to legislate for public access to government documents with the introduction of their Freedom of the Press Act. This act abolished the censorship of printed publications, and it granted the community access to documents drawn up by government. In addition, Sweden wrote freedom of the press into its constitution and thereby enshrined the notion that freedom of writing and printing and people's access to those publications is basically the backbone of their free and democratic state. Meanwhile, around the same time over the Atlantic, one of the founding fathers of the United States, the 4th US President, James Madison, also recognised the importance of public access to government information, and he identified it also as a cornerstone of democracy in the US. In one of his speeches, he noted that a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives, and they must have the means of obtaining it. And he worked tirelessly to ensure that this right was included in the Constitution of the United States. So that's what's happening in information access. It was all fairly quiet on the privacy front until 1927, with the US Supreme Court case of Olmstead versus the United States, in which the court reviewed whether the use of wiretapped private telephone conversations obtained covertly by FBI agents and then subsequently used as evidence constituted a violation of an individual's rights under the 4th and 5th Amendments of the Constitution. And as we know, Americans do not like any violation of their constitutional rights. In a dissenting judgment, Justice Louis Brandeis wrote that the right to be left alone is the most comprehensive of our rights, and the right most valued by civilised men and women. To protect that right, every unjustifiable intrusion by the government upon the privacy of the individual, whatever the means employed, must be deemed a violation of the 4th Amendment. Now, these words became known as the Brandeis dissent, and they've subsequently become widely cited and relied upon around the world. The description of the reasonable expectation of privacy that citizens have is enshrined in legislation around the world, and including ours here in Queensland. Our Information Privacy Act actually uses those words, unjustifiable intrusion into the private lives of individuals. The next major milestone occurred in 1946, when the General Assembly of the United Nations met for its first sitting and passed Resolution 59.1, and that provides that freedom of information is a fundamental human right, and it's the touchstone of all the freedoms to which the United Nations is consecrated. This is then quickly followed up 2 years later when the UN General Assembly adopted and proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Motivated by the experiences of the preceding world wars, the Universal Declaration was the first time that all UN member countries agreed on a comprehensive statement of inalienable, universal human rights. Article 12 is particularly important. It enshrines the right to privacy as a fundamental human right and states, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with their privacy, family, home, or correspondence. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Article 19 is also significant as it encapsulates the right to freedom of opinion and expression, including the right to seek and receive information. So as an aside, these rights have recently been made law here in Queensland too, through the enactment of the Human Rights Act 2019, which comes into full effect early next year. So on the 27th of February this year, Queensland joined the Australian Capital Territory and Victoria in being the only Australian jurisdictions with statutory protection for human rights. There is no Commonwealth Human Rights Act, and it's basically up to each state to try and protect the human rights of their people. Our Act is solid. It's been described as one of the most broad-reaching and accessible human rights acts in Australia. So now it's up to us to implement that. So then against this international backdrop, Queensland also started making some moves towards recognising the rights of people to access government information and protect privacy rights. The first major milestone here in Queensland was the introduction of the Invasion of Privacy Act in 1971. It's still in force today, and it deals with matters like invasion of home privacy. So if your neighbour sets up a CCTV camera that looks right into your bathroom, for instance, a place where you would have an expectation of personal privacy, then that becomes a breach of the Invasion of Privacy Act. It also deals with listening devices. So it's not an offence to audio record a conversation to which you are a party. You don't have to seek the permission of the other people involved. You don't even need to tell them you're doing it. If you're a party to the conversation, you're free to record that. There are restrictions then on what you can do with it in terms of an evidentiary perspective, but we get a lot of calls from people who are concerned through the inquiry service if they're going into a work meeting, say that they think it's going to be an HR issue, whether they can record that without letting anyone know, and the answer is yes, you can. It's not a breach of the Invasion of Privacy Act. Next big development was the Commonwealth Freedom of Information Act. It forms the basis for open government in Australia, and it gives members of the public the right to access documents of federal ministers and Commonwealth agencies of government. It was the first information access law to be passed in Australia, and the state jurisdictions have largely based their legislation on the Commonwealth FOI Act. It's a similar story when it comes to privacy, although the states have been much slower to follow the Commonwealth, as it introduced its Privacy Act in 1988, and as we know in Queensland, we only introduced ours in 2009. That then brings us to the Fitzgerald inquiry, and really the birth of a more open, transparent, accountable government here in Queensland. In response to several media reports, including the airing of The Moonlight State on Four Corners in 1987, the acting Premier at the time, Bill Gunn, tasked former Federal Court Judge Tony Fitzgerald with presiding over a commission of inquiry into corruption and other illegal activities within the Queensland Government and associated police misconduct. The Commission handed down its report on the 3rd of July 1989. Corruption charges were then laid against several high-profile politicians, 3 former ministers were jailed, and the Premier, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, resigned under a fairly heavy cloud. Importantly, the inquiry also recognised the importance of freedom of information legislation as a means of keeping the government accountable for its actions and decisions. So in 1992, the Queensland Government introduced the Freedom of Information Act to enable people to make applications to access government documents. There were checks and balances built into the legislation through exclusions and exemptions for example, cabinet documents or information affecting legal proceedings or an individual's personal affairs. While the introduction of the FOI Act was a significant advance, the power over whether a person would get access to the information they requested was still very much in the government's hands, and it was tightly controlled. There was no proactive disclosure or administrative access or mandatory publication of information under the FOI Act, so the only way people had to try and get government documents was through the fairly technical and time-consuming FOI process. This became known as the pull model of information access, where you had to try and pull information out of government. And it just became more and more entrenched over the next 15 years, as particularly departmental FOI officers came to know how to use particularly the exemptions to their favour. So If they didn't want to disclose information, they'd bundle it into a cart, wheel it past somewhere where Cabinet may or may not have been meeting at the time, and claim Cabinet in confidence over all the documents. This continued on until 2007, when Anna Bligh came to power as the Premier of Queensland. One of the very first things that she did was to announce a broad-ranging review of the FOI Act. So Dr. David Solomon, who was a preeminent QC and administrative lawyer, was appointed as the independent chair, and together with a panel of experts, they were asked to assess whether the FOI laws in Queensland were effectively working and what improvements could be made. The Solomon report recommended that the government overhaul completely its approach to information. It proposed moving to a push model with greater proactive and routine release of information, meaning that formal access applications under the Act should only be used as a last resort. Agencies should make as much information publicly available as possible and have strong and robust administrative access schemes in place to facilitate easy access to information by members of the public. To achieve this, the report recommended repealing the FOI Act and replacing it with two new pieces of legislation, the Right to Information Act and the Information Privacy Act. The RTI Act applies to all government information. So as I mentioned earlier, all information that's in the government's possession or under its legal control. The Information Privacy Act is similar in that it deals with government information, but it's particularly concerned with a subset, which is personal information. So that's any information that can be used to identify a living individual. So the Information Privacy Act sets out the rules for how governments handle the personal information they hold, and it gives individuals the right to access and amend their personal information if it's wrong. So the government supported, in full or in part, the report's 141 recommendations and committed to sweeping reforms to make Queensland the most open and accountable government in Australia. So, a decade on, how are we doing? One of the roles of my office is to monitor agencies' compliance with information access and privacy obligations. We have a dedicated audit and evaluation team, and what they do is black magic and voodoo, because it's all with auditing and numbers and figures and ensuring people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So we thought this to be a particularly significant year to gauge how agencies view their progress towards implementing their responsibilities under the RTI and Information Privacy Acts, given they've had 10 years to work towards compliance. So we've conducted agency self-assessments, a bit like what I understand you're doing in the next session, which is a self-assessment. We've been doing them every 4 years since 2010, and we've used that data to provide agencies with snapshots of their progress in complying with their information access and privacy obligations, as well as creating a picture over time for us of how agencies have progressed in that time. Our findings are set out in the 10 Years On report, which was tabled in Parliament in June this year, and there were some interesting results. So as you can see from the slide, 224 Queensland government agencies were invited to participate, with an 87% response rate, which was really high. We were really pleased with that. We asked agencies to measure their performance through a series of 235 questions. So it was a fairly time-consuming task, and we do thank all those agencies who were involved. So the questions were based on a wide range of legislative requirements, policy and process developments, and examples of best practice they might have initiated within their own agency. The self-assessment questions asked agencies about whether they had implemented their obligations under the RTI and IP Acts, and they could respond in one of 4 ways. From yes, the obligation was fully implemented, to it's in progress, it's been identified but not actioned, or lastly, we have no plans in place to address the issue. So 10 years on from the introduction of the Acts, we expected that agencies should have answered yes, i.e. fully implemented, most of their obligations. But what we did note was that the results varied quite a lot depending upon the agency type. So we grouped the agencies into recognised sectors. So departments, local governments, hospital and health services, universities and TAFE colleges, and government-owned corporations. So we found that the sectors obviously differed in the amount and type of information they manage, and then also how they provide access to it. So for example, if we look at the number of formal RTI access requests, under the Right to Information Act or the Information Privacy Act. And we can see from the graphs there Although other agencies, the other agencies category, makes up 41% of the total number of all agencies, they only receive 7% of applications. So other agencies captured statutory authorities and bodies that didn't fit neatly into one of the other categories. So for example, the Electoral Commission of Queensland, Legal Aid, the Legal Services Commission, the Ombudsman's Office, the CCC, Queensland Rail, QSuper, those types of agencies. So while they made up 41% of all agency types, they only get 7% of all RTI applications. Conversely, government departments comprise only 9% of agencies, but they receive 50% of all applications. And the Queensland Police Service consistently topped the list of agencies with the highest number of applications. It was close to 2,500 RTI and IP access applications were received by QPS last year. Queensland's hospital and health services receive a high proportion of applications, with 32% of the total number of applications, but they comprise only 7% of agencies. Relevantly for you guys, the local government sector makes up 34% of all Queensland government agencies, so that's a fair swag, but you only receive 10% of all applications. Now, if we broaden out the findings a bit to look at how the agencies rated in terms of full compliance with their obligations under the Right to Information and Information Privacy Acts by sector, we can see that all sectors have reported increasing maturity with their information access and privacy obligations, so it was really pleasing to see. Government departments and hospital and health services have consistently reported high levels of compliance with their obligations, with departments answering yes or fully compliant to 90% of the questions, and hospital and health services answering yes to 84% of questions. So these two sectors combined receive over 80% of all the RTI and IP access applications in Queensland, and they're lucky in that they tend to have huge numbers of dedicated information access and privacy staff, and that is what their job is, to process RTI and IP access applications as they come in. This is in contrast to other agencies, especially smaller local governments, and I echo what John said earlier, you guys do it tough. RTI and privacy is often just one more job tacked on to the role description of the records manager or the governance officer or the EA to the CEO or whoever happens to be standing still for long enough. And this is reflected in the results. There has been pleasing improvement in the levels of full compliance in the local government sector and other agencies, despite what we know are your staffing and resource constraints. Drilling down further into the findings, it's interesting to look at which topics have the highest and lowest levels of compliance. So as you can see from the infographic, trends have emerged over the years. So the higher performing areas of compliance across the board have been application handling practices. That's how agencies deal with the RTI and IP requests that they receive. Engaging with applicants has also been an area of high compliance, which is really pleasing. That's also tied in with how agencies handle the applications they receive. And we've seen a strong correlation between good engagement with applicants and good application handling. Privacy has also been a strong area, as well as clearly defining roles and responsibilities within agencies. Now, we call these kind of things the low-hanging fruit. There are some easy wins in there, admittedly. I mean, application handling. It's a legislative requirement. It's set out in the Right to Information Act. It's a process that you have to follow, you have to comply. It sets out what you need to do at each stage of the process. So it's not altogether surprising that agencies would self-assess as being fully compliant in that area. Where compliance becomes more difficult is where there is less prescriptive legal obligation, and agencies need to be more proactive with developing their own policies and procedures, or where they're trying to effect cultural change within their organisation. So some of the lower performing topics include continuous improvement of information access and privacy functions, ongoing performance monitoring to see how your agency is going with compliance, consultation with the community to see what types of information they're interested in. So actively seeking out, finding out what people want to know about and then making that information available to them. And also administrative access, so people don't have to use the formal access application process within the legislation. Overall, we've seen an increase in agencies' compliance with information access policy development and committing to training and resources to ensure that all staff are aware of their information and privacy responsibilities. Balanced against that, there has been a decline in compliance over the 10 years for adequacy of staffing resources and adopting that push model of pro-disclosure and making information publicly available. So embedding strong information access and privacy practices has consistently been identified as a challenge, particularly for the local government sector. And this is due in large part to the nature of the work that councils do. You know, you guys deliver a huge range of necessary services in direct response to the needs and priorities of your local community. So things like RTI, privacy, administrative access, and as you know, record keeping can often come a fair way down the list and are probably not given the attention they deserve. So where to from here? Well, in 2010, the Queensland State Archives held 1.2 million items in its collection. In 2018, so in 8 years, this had grown tenfold to almost 12 million items. The information age and the resultant exponential growth in information production has been felt all over the world, and the digital universe continues to expand at a phenomenal rate, doubling in size every 2 years. To date, there have been no significant amendments to either the Right to Information Act or the Information Privacy Act to recognise and bring them into line with current and emerging technologies. When the acts were brought into force in July 2009, there was no iPad. The first one was launched in January 2010. There was no Instagram. Again, it was October 2010. For those who'd been using it, Facebook was just a fun piece of kit that you could use to secretly, you know, check out what your high school friends look like now or to post funny cat videos. Most people's mobiles were still dumb. We used them for calling and texting, that was about it, because the first iPhone was only launched in 2007. Technological change is accelerating today at an unprecedented rate, and along with that is the exponential growth in the volume and type of information that we create. This presents agencies with, as you know, tremendous challenges. We need to accommodate a greater volume of information, which is created more quickly and which comes from a lot more sources. In every instance, agencies need to consider information access and privacy requirements. For some agencies, these new demands will compound existing challenges. In particular, we have identified a number of issues that will demand significant attention in the coming years. Firstly, maintaining robust records that are easily locatable. Governments need to adapt their processes to capture and retain information from contemporary communication systems. So, messaging tools, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and a myriad of other communication products are now being used to conduct government business. Personal devices and private accounts used for creating records that fall within the definition of a public record need to be captured appropriately and in accordance with relevant requirements. Government at all levels needs to keep pace with modern forms of record keeping. We need to start managing information as an asset in an increasingly automated and smart environment. We need to build more privacy protections into the design of mobile apps and other emerging technologies as a means of minimising the risk of privacy breaches into the future. We've recently done an audit on mobile app use across Queensland State Government, and we realised and found that over 60% of government departments, 33% of hospital and health services, and 25% of councils reported that they have developed and released a mobile app that collects personal information. We expect these numbers to only ever, of course, increase as mobile apps become commonplace for the delivery of necessary government services. In terms of apps, community trust is key to delivering a service. Users who are confident that a government agency handles their personal information appropriately are more likely to maintain trust in the agency, use the agency's app, and then benefit from it. So to achieve this trust, governments need to design mobile apps with privacy in mind and build appropriate privacy protections into all stages of the life cycle, from design and development through to operation and review. In conclusion then, across the 10 years since the introduction of the RTI and IP Acts, we have seen positive progress across all sectors as agencies work towards achieving compliance with key responsibilities under the Acts. But there is some work yet to be done, particularly around facilitating greater and easier administrative access to information. Openly sharing government information with the community improves trust, transparency, and accountability. While it continues to be important, it also presents increasing challenges for government. So too does the responsibility to diligently safeguard individuals' personal information the public agencies are entrusted to collect, use and share. So if you or anyone in your agency needs assistance with any aspect of information access or privacy compliance, we at the OIC are only too happy to help. We love getting out and about on the road. So far this year I have been to Toowoomba, Gayndah, Bundaberg, Charters Towers and here in Townsville with my colleague Lem, who is our Principal Privacy Officer. They tend to send us out on the road to come to councils and talk to staff, talk to councillors, deliver training sessions and help you guys, help you to help yourselves in terms of RTI and privacy. So if you're interested at all, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me through the inquiry service, the number's there, or if you have any questions, call through, keeps me employed. Does anyone have any questions now? I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes?
A policy within council? I've just done a policy,
okay.
Right to information and
yep.
etc. So
yes. Great.
It's just simple.
Yeah.
And it's really just explaining the definitions and the process.
Yeah.
And I've also done up just a very small survey to send to the community on what sort of information they actually want on our web page, what they want to see. And I got this through the webinar through the Logan City.
Yep.
Yeah. Excuse me. So yeah, do we?
Excellent.
Is it essential to have a policy? But I just think it was more a getting it out there through our staff.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just explaining to them, you know, what it was about.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Yeah, while it's not a legislative requirement, it is something that our audit team do audit against. So every year they do what they call desktop audits, where they sit in our office and they look at your websites and look at what information you make available, and you know, if you can put your policy up on your website and things like that. Yeah. It's a really good idea, and the fact that you've gone out and consulted with the community is fantastic, because that's, as I just said, something that we noticed is not an area of high compliance. So that's a really good start.
So it was just a community, it'll just be a community, communication strategy, and it's just a 2-page, and then sort of 4 questions on the back page. If they,
Excellent. I'd be really interested to hear what feedback you get and how that goes. It'd be really interesting, because we don't often hear about councils engaging with their people to work out what it is that they're interested in. So yeah, that'd be really good. If you could let me know, I'd be very keen to know. And just before I forget, as was mentioned, Logan City Council have been doing a lot of work in this space, and they have a lot of template letters and a lot of policies and processes that they're very happy to share. So if that's something that you guys are interested in, I can facilitate that. One of the first initiatives that we did this year around Right to Information Day, which was in September, was we co-hosted a local government practitioner forum with Logan City Council, and so basically people in RTI and privacy from all around the state were able to, had some big platform, they were able to dial in and get a direct feed and ask questions and engage in a similar sort of way to what you guys are doing now. So if that's also something that you're interested in, is joining that community, if that's part of your role as well, then again I'd be happy to facilitate that for you.
We do have a course online.
Yes, we do, absolutely.
And it's worth you guys getting on. I did the course in both.
Excellent.
And it was interesting because, you think when you're answering, I thought I answered that one right, and it won't let me go any further. But I learned a little bit from it, and it's worth doing. It doesn't take long, and
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?